Do you want to finish your bar?
No, I just want a bite.
Okay.
Shit's like cardboard. It's going to take 30 minutes to...
I'm a little tired today. All right.
All right. Should we just jump right into it?
Into hooks?
React hooks?
Yeah, let's do
That'll wake
it.
you up.
Is everyone really annoyed that we keep talking about React?
Is anyone still listening to this podcast?
I think it's super important for every UI developer to be following the trends of all the frameworks, even if you're not developing in them. I guess, do I really believe that? Because if I really believe that, then like I would say it's important to learn like RX, and I don't really know RX because that's like a fundamental part of like Angular.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, also too, like we took us a long time to like learn JSX.
Right.
So
I still don't know it. I still make typos all the time. That don't make sense to me.
I still do class and then wait for the error.
Yeah. So we do want to, what we actually want to talk about? What's the substance of what we want to talk about?
Well, I think,
It started with Rich's presentation.
Yeah. Kind of go, yeah, let's start there.
So Rich Harris, the creator of Svelte, which is another JavaScript framework, gave a presentation where he talked about essentially some of the things he found lacking in the React hooks model. And he kind of, I think there's the critique part of his presentation, and then there's kind of like his explanation as to why. And he kind of puts his explanation out there as like, because it's like a religion or something like that. He's kind of talking about, talk is like metaphysics and JavaScript, and he's kind of talking about how there's a lot of elegance to functional programming and the idea of pure functions. And so almost as if that became a goal in and of itself, as opposed to a means to an end. It became an end of itself. And so he's saying that's like the allure of it and everything. And but then when you break it down, it actually doesn't fit. It doesn't align. That part is kind of interesting. I think the other part that was, less of like kind of a thought experiment and more applicable to kind of the real world developers' day-to-day experience is the fact that he pointed out that it's not actually true that UI is a function of state, which is kind of the whole mental model of this paradigm.
Yeah.
So the whole, like one of the things you learn with React, and we also cover this in our series on declarative rendering, when we talk about doing templates in Ember and omitting states, we make this point, right? We say that declarative rendering is declaring all your state, rendering as a function of state, and updating state on changes, basically, right? Those are the 3 points. And how you can have a bug if you forget any one of those things. And so in Ember, you want your templates to feel like that. You want to be thinking about UI as a function of state there. But we usually keep that to the domain of our templates. That's where it is most applicable. It's where it makes sense. And React, specifically React hooks, takes the idea that basically the entire program should be thought of like this.
Yeah.
And that even things like side effects should be thought of as a function of state. And so you think of the effect that is being triggered by a state that's triggering it, or not even trigger's not even the right word, because trigger is like an imperative thing. It's like what state syncs with this effect.
Given the state that's in my component, what thing should happen?
Right.
What effects should run?
Right.
And so effects are tied to state.
Right. They're not tied to any sort of life cycle. They're not tied to time at all. They're just tied to state.
Right.
They're a function of state.
Right. Where in Ember, we would think, okay, they're mostly tied to life cycle in the sense that like I do a lot of setup work and did insert element, all those hooks. That's how we think of our Ember apps.
Which is also how React components work pre-hooks.
Yep.
So Rich kind of we're definitely going to link to this in the show notes. And if you haven't gone through it, unfortunately the talk wasn't recorded, but he basically has this whole presentation up and he wrote his whole talk in the slide notes. So you just open the link and you hit S and you'll be able to read through his talk. And he basically says that this effort is like a misguided effort because all the little areas where the functional model doesn't line up with the reality of building like a stateful UI application, it's like death by 1,000 cuts. And it maybe suggests that it's the wrong model for it. So that's kind of what his talk's about.
Yeah.
So what do you think about it?
I liked it. It's weird. I don't know where I land on this. I've in the last few weeks I've been doing more hooks code, and I do like it. There's definitely some areas where I know that I probably have bugs in my code, and I'm not sure about the correct way to write that. So I think one of the things that came up from his talk is like asynchronous code. What is it? It's like stale state closed over by asynchronous code. What's like the way that this gets?
Yeah, stale closures or whatever, stale state due to closures.
Yeah. So this is always tricky, and it's usually like I don't know it's a bug until.
Yeah, we've had this bug several times. We can always reason our way to it after the fact. It's like a post hoc ergo proctor hoc or whatever.
Okay, sure.
There after the fact, therefore because of the fact. Anyways, it's like it's post hoc justification for what it is. It's not something that we knew beforehand, or even if one of us wrote it, we're both looking at it. It's not clear by looking at it that there was a bug to begin with.
Right.
And this has happened like with our to-do app, the simplest to-do app we could possibly conceive of writing in miragejs.com's homepage. And, that to-do app has asynchronous callbacks because that's the whole point of Mirage is like actually writing a real app that touches real network code. And so it's by its nature asynchronous. And so there's actually, first of all, there's not actually a lot of examples where you just want to say, I want to save a to-do. What is the idiosyncratic way to do it?
Yep.
You actually won't find a lot of that in the React guides, which is like pretty surprising. Second, a couple months ago when I was doing this for the first time, I basically asked Ryan Florence and Dan EmberMap on Twitter, and I got two different answers for how you should save a to-do. And so it's kind of agreed upon that when you first render the to-do app, if you need to fetch to-dos on render, that's a side effect of rendering. So you use effect and you fetch to-dos. Roughly equivalent in Ember to like rendering a component and putting a fetch call and did insert element. But not exactly the same, but roughly the same.
Mm-hmm.
And then, in Ember, if you were to click save on a new to-do, you type in the input field and you hit save, we would have an action. And we would take the attributes from the input field, make the request, and then, Ember Data would like basically update its store, or you could imagine like taking the response and like pushing it into an array or something like that. But those series of like imperative steps as a result of the action would just be in an action in Ember, and they would just happen. And we don't really think about that in the same way that we think about like did insert element needs to trigger a thing. It's just like it's not a result of rendering. It's a result of the user clicking the button. So you just put it in an action. You just put it in a function that you run when the user clicks the button. That's how you think about it when you're describing the UI, and that's how you write it in the code.
Yeah. I'm not sure that like React developers would tell you. I know you got two different answers, but I don't know that like, do you think most React developers are saying that like most React developers, I think, would describe the problem just like you're describing it.
Yeah, so in React, when we coded this, what we did was we wrote a function that was like create to do, and then the button has like an on-click equals create to do, and it does exactly that, which is what we did in Ember. And so talking to Ryan and Dan on Twitter, and what eventually came out was like, that's how we did it, and, we were getting confused about some stale state bugs that we were hitting because useEffect, you do run into that. And
I think that
it was a timing thing,
right?
So we have this behavior in the to-do app where when you like click check, there's a time delay before we delete the to-do, so you have a chance to uncheck it, and that created this stale state bug. Yep. And so we were kind of like, okay, if the user takes an action like clicking a checkbox or a button, and then you have some async code to run that like might affect state, what's the way to do that? And kind of to the punchline here, like, the way we wrote it is basically how Dan EmberMap said he would write it. And, he was like the imperative steps are a result of the user clicking the button. They're not like an effect. Whereas Ryan Florence was saying he tries to push this model to the extreme, the React model, where basically kind of he was saying things that are asynchronous are always kind of like an effect or something like that.
Basically, any code that should run, you can always be declared from like state. So you would have like set is saving to true.
Right.
And there'd be some effect that
watches is saving.
Yeah.
And then triggers an effect.
Right. You can think of this in Ember as like an observer.
An
like
observer,
if you didn't write any actions.
Right. You would have to set some state, and then you'd have to have some observer function that looks at that and then runs afterwards. Now we know observers in Ember are kind of like an anti-pattern, but that's kind of besides the point. It's more just like what is the mental model. And so first of all, I think most people would do what we did and take Dan's advice, but this is why I was so amused by Rich's talk, because first of all, that's not like a good thing that they disagree, because Ryan makes his living teaching React, and so ideally you'd want him to have the same answer to such a simple fundamental question as Dan would, someone on the React core team. And then second, Rich's part in the presentation where he basically has like a fake Twitter conversation between a React expert and a React core team member, and the expert is like, look at this cool thing I did with hooks, and then the React core team member is like, oh, that's, you're actually gonna run into problems if you do like that for these subtle reasons. And then the core team member or the expert is like, okay, I don't really get it, but I can do that. It's kind of confusing though. And then the core team member is like, oh, don't worry, you just need to reconfigure your brain until you understand hooks. And so it's like, I know we haven't been doing React for long at all. And so it's kind of okay for us to run into these things, I guess, and give React the benefit of the doubt. Now we've been doing this for a while, and we know UI development. So sometimes it's strange when we run into these issues when it feels like we're trying to do something extremely basic, but that's fine. We can give it the React the benefit of the doubt, but it still is funny though that you actually see this happening. Like on Twitter, you see experts running into these issues and these subtle ways that hooks trip you up. And Rich's whole thesis is that the reason that you're getting tripped up is because trying to represent effects as a function of state is actually not, it's too far removed from the thing you're actually doing. So, just to take the simple example, go ahead.
No, go.
The simple example where like I click the button and then I want to like run a post request and then .then and then is loading as false or is saving as false. That's like what I would tell you as a product person. Like if I was just sitting with someone, what should happen when I click this thing? If you told me like to build that, I need to set some state and then trigger a side effect as a result of that state change to do this thing, like that is already removed from it. And even beyond that, Rich goes to talk about like this idea that the whole point of hooks is to remove the notion of like life cycle from our entire application. And so anytime you try to think in terms of life cycle, like mounting a component or what happens after a second it's been mounted, like you're kind of thinking about it wrong.
Yeah, this idea, the idea like hooks can make all of your code declarative. We've seen declarative code is good for
the
UIs.
Benefits of it.
Yeah. And so what if we could get rid of all this? But then there's like still this question. It's like, well, I don't know. I still think of my app. I still think of components being rendered like with a life cycle and with those imperative steps.
Yeah.
And so maybe maybe to Rich's point, the disconnect is too far. And I guess a big question for me is like, will we ever like say like, oh yeah, remember when we used to think of life cycles, but now we think of it this way? Or will there always be some mapping in our brain? Because like you said, when we're talking to a product person, we're thinking in terms of like,
you're on this page for this long, or after a second this will happen, or once you leave the page then this thing happens. Like all those things are basically not describable as like a function of state, because they are really about transitions,
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a good question. Jason Miller also got involved in some of these tweets, who's the creator of Preact, and said he basically made like a use mount hook so that he could just easily see if he needed like to do something on mount or unmount. And Dan was basically saying that that's like the wrong way to think about it. And so again, it's not just because we haven't been doing React. You got the creator of Preact here who's kind of confused. So yeah, I thought it was interesting. I've never had a problem with actions in Ember. Now we've had a problem with like set is destroyed, calling set undestroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you could argue, like the steel man argument here is like, that's because you weren't thinking about the programming model of like using an action in an Ember component didn't force you to think about what happens when the state changes.
Yeah.
And even though like hooks are awkward when doing something like a set timeout or an async call, you're actually forced to think about what happens when every piece of that state changes. So you're actually tackling that problem up front. Yep. This is like what Sebastian would say.
Yep.
And it's harder in like this trivial case you're pointing out, but over time it's like you're always having to think about this in a consistent way, so it's better.
I can think of an example from Ember that's really hard that is easy with hooks, and that's so I have like a form, and that form takes a model. It's like a subscription edit form. It takes a subscription model, and then in its did insert element hook, it does a bunch of setup, like has to fetch some more data for the form, fetches some data for the subscription, and just does some setup, and then template with actions, blah blah blah. That form renders inside of a modal. And so like that form, you like open that modal for a subscription, you render that form in that modal, and then like when you're done, you close the modal. Mm-hmm. So that form is never changing its subscription while it's rendered. So does that make sense? Like that situation? Okay.
Yeah, you hit edit and you're editing a subscription and then
you save it or you cancel it.
Either way, the model's torn down.
Yeah. So the life cycle of of this component of the form is like it is for a single subscription. And then we went ahead and we added this form onto a route. So not in a modal where you could click, back and next. So now you have this form that's rendered and you're changing the subscription model in it. And guess what? That did insert element hook. It only runs once.
Yep.
And I want to walk through the steps here that took to fix this because this was surprisingly hard to fix. No, that's not fair. It wasn't hard. It was a lot of steps.
Yeah.
So the first thing was like,
you didn't know it was a bug. Like there's nothing that told nothing about the code or the model or anything. The feedback, the tests told you that this was buggy.
Right. And also too, when I was building it, like the UIs were very like, this is tied to the lifecycle of the component.
Right.
Don't even need to think about this right now.
Right.
So I had to do, let's see. My first thing was like, oh, okay, so the attributes are changing. So did receive adders. So I'm just going to move all the setup logic to did receive adders. That was fine. That created a problem that there's other attributes passed into this form. So now any attribute that changes
resets all of that new
it was
state.
just triggering all the stuff. And lucky for us, like we had like our APIs are pretty good at like caching themselves, and it was hard to see the bug. But you could have your dev tools open and just see a bunch of API requests.
I see.
So then the next thing was like, I still want to use did receive adders, but I want to use, there's an awesome Ember add-on. It's like Ember diff adders that tells you when one of the attributes changes. So I could do, I really only want to run this setup code when the subscription model changes. So I set up this Ember diff adders on the subscription model, and that decorates did receive adders. And so I do that, and that
right there, it almost sounds like you were just describing a hook, because when they say like it syncs with state, you were like, I really want to run this code when the state changes.
Well, that's yes. I will get there after my 30 minutes of explaining this bug. So I do that, but then like did receive adders or Ember diff adders only runs when the attribute changes, because it's the whole idea of like the attribute changes. So it doesn't run on the initial did receive adders. So then I abstract like my setup code into a function, call it once and did insert. Yeah, exactly. And I get that. And so it took me like a whole bunch of steps. And by the way, if I was making a new component today, I wouldn't start with this. Like the whole process I just described, I would just do everything all over again and did insert element, because that's what I need. That's simple.
Right.
This stuff feels like more complex. I'll deal with it later.
Right.
So going back to hooks, like hooks kind of eliminates this problem. Hooks says that like it's like what you identify. It's when I have this subscription, I run this code, and that this code
is really synchronized with that piece of state.
Yeah.
And you're forced to think about that from the beginning.
And the setup code. Maybe this is like the best case scenario for hooks, but like the setup code it's not a lot of extra code. It's not like mind bendy. There's stuff about hooks that's mind bendy. This is like not a mind bendy thing. It's when I have the subscription model, I run the setup code, and now I know I don't even have to think about it. That's the thing. It forces me to address this from the beginning. I don't have to ever think about what happens when the subscription model changes.
So what was the code that you had to run when that thing changed? Was it anything async?
Yes. There was data fetching from the server.
Gotcha.
So yes.
Gotcha. Yep. Gotcha. Cool. That makes sense.
So yeah, that I think that's one of the things where it's like,
yeah, benefit of the model.
Yeah. I'll also say, like, I think because I'm new to React and building UIs has been really hard. Like building UIs has been hard. I'm still all in.
Yeah.
I still have those magic moments where it's just
yeah.
like, I still want to continue to build UIs, but it's been hard. Like there's things about it that are hard.
Sure.
And so I think that a lot of excitement around hooks comes like, oh, this is a new thing. Will it make building UIs be easier? And I can see getting excited about that. It's kind of the way I feel. It's like, yeah, I don't know if this is going to work, but
Interesting.
But hey, like the people that are advocating for this are smart, and if it does make UI building easier, then
are you saying like sometimes like those times when we're like pairing or working with someone and like we're doing a data fetching and we realize we have some old state in the store, and then you're like having to, and you're just kind of like, there's no easy way to do this, what we're trying to do right now, or like a resize observer on something while you're scrolling to make it and then you like see a hook that's like use window width and you're like, maybe that will actually.
Yeah, I think I'm making more like general point where it's like, hey, here's a new way of thinking, and if you think in this new way, it'll be so much easier to build UIs. That there's something about that excites me, and there's something about my past experience building UIs that says, okay, even if you're wrong and you're like you're batshit crazy, I'm still gonna listen to you because I'm desperate for something that not desperate, but maybe a little.
Yeah, it's a pain point.
Yeah.
Building the kinds of apps that you want to still takes so much time and effort and everything.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's sort of the impression I get from a lot of people that are like, hooks are amazing. It's
cool. Interesting. Hey everyone, just wanted to take a quick break to tell you about today's sponsor, and that's Next Release. Next Release is a tool that helps you automate your product's release notes. Are you tired of getting asked, what did we ship last month? If so, you should check out Next Release's automatic release note generation and distribution tool. It integrates directly with GitHub, so it just works with your existing pull request workflow. All it takes to set up is 3 clicks. Then, all your release notes will be generated based on your team's actual work. Whether you need to update your colleagues over Slack, email, or just with a Markdown or Word document, Next Release can push out updates when you've added features, fixed bugs, or even just changed some copy on the marketing site. So stop wasting time searching through Jira, Slack, and GitHub just to find out what you did last month, and give Next Release a try. It's going to save you and your team a ton of time. Head on over to nextrelease.io/Ember, and you can sign up for a free 30-day trial. And guess what? Next Release is actually an Ember app, and it's built using modern Ember concepts from Ember Octane. So as a special thank you to EmberMap listeners, you can actually get a 10% discount for the entirety of your subscription. All you have to do is mention that you heard about Next Release on the EmberMap Podcast when you sign up. Again, that website is nextrelease.io/Ember. Huge thanks to Next Release for sponsoring the episode, and now back to the show. Yeah, we had another bug in our Mirage site, little React app, and it was, what happened again? Oh, the mounted thing. The reset stopped working because, so this is the other, So related to a lot of this conversation with, Rich's talk and everything, some of the people were saying like, in the attempt to make everything declarative in this way, the times where it's not are pretty bad. Now, the times where you'd benefit from it, like the scenario you just described, is a good thing. But then the trade-off is that there's lots of times where it's not as intuitive, or it's actually doesn't fit well. And so you end up using, one thing is like you end up using a lot of refs, which is like we talked about a couple episodes ago, where in Ember we always, the design in Ember is deliberately to use like object references because you always get like the latest value. And whereas in React, it's not true with hooks, right? So ref is like an escape hatch there, but sometimes it feels less like an escape hatch and more like a leaky abstraction, because even in a very simple case, this bug that we ran into, you have to, if you want to do something like not run a callback in an async function, because the component's been unmounted and like calling set undestroyed object, basically, you need some sense of like if it's destroyed, and you can't just do if this dot is destroyed because there's no this, and so you have to like create a variable for that, and you can't use state because like a state hook is like rerun every time, and so we reached for like a ref to use this because a ref is stable cross renders, and so you can like set it to true and then set it to false. And what happened was like we did that, and then if you refresh the app, like it's still false, so the callback never ran even if it got like re-rendered. And so there's like a solution to this, but that was confusing.
Yeah, I was gonna say we reached for the ref because we look at ref as like if we were gonna do this in Ember, we'd set it on like this,
right?
And so we reached for the ref. Now, what was the bug? Because the ref, we had another hook that was depending on the ref. We had another
the callback that updated the to-dos checked if isMounted.current was true or false. And so as soon as you hit refresh,
as soon as you hit the
reload app,
reset
app, yeah. Then the effect the effect was like torn down, and in the cleanup we had originally returned a cleanup function that set isMounted to false, but it was also getting run when the effect was rerun. So it's not that it was getting unmounted, it was just getting re-rendered. And so this is kind of like thinking like, that state, how is that effect that fetches the data? You have the to-do app that renders, and it needs to set the data, and like what state is it synced with? And when we wrote it, it was like, well, when we first render the app, it's like needs to fetch. So it's just synced with like just rendering the app. So you do like an empty array there. But then you add a button that's like refresh, and you can like, if you click reset the app, like you increment a counter and you just sync it with that state and everything, that every time that changes, you just redo it. But then you have this isMounted issue.
Yeah, it's almost
it's just like there's no clean way to really do it. I mean, the final solution used like a local variable, which was fine, but it's like also strange.
Well, I think one of the problems here is we added this ref to track if the component was mounted, and the hook had a cleanup function to track when it's unmounted, and we knew that if the thing is unmounted, don't set data on the component. And then we added something else to the hook. We had this refresh count, and when the refresh count changes, we rerun the hook.
Right.
Which caused the hook to be cleaned up.
A ref called isMounted to be false, which is not actually true.
Right.
It's just that the effect is being rerun.
Right. So we originally wrote this cleanup thing,
thinking it was only going to get run when the component was unmounted.
And now, but even if it did, like let's just say like we add the ref and it only runs when the component gets unmounted, and then we have to come in and now we have to add like this refresh counter.
Right. You still have to reset it to true.
Yeah. So now it's just not clear that like you add in a new dependency to your effect.
Yeah.
And it's not clear that like, oh, this dependency actually makes the cleanup of your effect invalid, a lie, basically.
Right.
And so that's it was kind of like the reverse order, but that's what bit us.
Right.
And so
it's not clear from looking at the code that it's buggy. You can't. It's hard to look at the code and just see the bug, like because we've had 4 or 5 of these bugs, and so we both have looked at it.
What would this look like in EmberMap?
I mean, I can't even look at our code right now and tell you if there's bugs or not.
I can. The answer is yes. I don't have to do anything there. How would we do this in an EmberMap? We would have like
we would use like concurrency.
Yeah. Okay. Let's imagine low level.
Not fair, yeah.
We would we'd have like did insert and will destroy element.
Yeah.
And we would set this is mounted there, and we'd know that this is the thing. No other state change in our component could ever run will destroy element. Right. And so that data was only going to be set there where we're within effect.
it can be running.
Changing
Re-render can happen anytime.
And changing the dependencies could change how your effects cleanup is run. Okay, so the cleanup in Ember is clear that it can only ever be run when the element's destroyed, where the cleanup in
the hook is like a black box.
Yeah, well, it's if a dependency changes.
Right. By the way, like, okay, so just to be charitable here to the kind of what's the React counter argument here. First, it's that you shouldn't really think about when your component's rendering or how often that thing is running. I mean, they're talking about like concurrent mode now and putting these on threads and stuff. Your code, that's why it has to be like pure and declarative, because it should just, even if we weren't unmounting it, like you should just not even have to think about that. Like you just describe it in what state it syncs with. This is like the theoretical thing, right? So I think once we looked at this for a while, our hook was very simple. If you haven't ever written React, if you're listening and you haven't ever written React, and you don't know what a hook is, just think about it like an action, like what we're talking about, where you click a button and then you want to like save it to do, and then then, and then set some state like this .set is saving is false, and like your UI updates because of that. So the hook is just like a function that you can do that. It's called like useEffect, and you just write that, just kind of hand wavy, right? So the charitable case here is like we were setting this like is mounted state or a variable and trying to think about it like that. But you're kind of already down the wrong path if you're doing that. What you really should, the real problem here is that there is a mismatch between the notion of a declarative effect and something like a chain of promises, because effects need to have this notion of a cleanup function, which is like if your effect is synchronized with count and count is 1, and your effect takes 10 seconds, it gets 5 seconds through, and then count changes to 2. What should you do in that case? Conceptually, if you were to describe it, this effect that happened, save to do, takes 10 seconds. If it's truly synced with counter and counter goes from 1 to 2, like the last one is not valid anymore, you should trigger a second instance of it that is using the new state. So if that's what you're telling me, React is saying, then like you need to tell me, okay, when count is 1, I start my thing, I get 5 seconds the way through, count goes to 2. I need to be able to throw away the whole world and rerun it from this new state, because that's how rendering works. Rendering says, given this state, give me the entire VDOM, the entire thing, and as soon as you change the state, I'm going to do it again. We're going to be able to throw away the entire world from the last state, re-get the entire thing, because UI is a function of state, and we have fully described our UI in terms of that state. So that's the stuff that enables the good stuff. That's what enables like the powerful stuff, is that if I know your state, I can give you a UI. And so that's the whole point of this hook stuff. And so the problem is that a chain of promises that you've run up here, you can't just say, I'm only halfway through, throw it away.
Yeah. This is good, because the hook, the effect, the use effect hook actually does work like this. You can throw the whole thing away, but the code you're running inside of it, you can't necessarily.
That's a great point.
And so the promise is, once you start that promise chain, we don't have a way to throw those promises away.
You could imagine putting every step of this .then in like its own effect, and like only running it if you've gotten to that step of the thing. Think about it, which is basically like a generator, which is what we were talking about when we kind of started talking about Ember concurrency.
Or I mean, what we did here is
so what we did was, what would it look like if promises were cancelable? Would that have helped us avoid this bug and made us?
It would look like a lot of comments on Twitter.
Well, would it have also gotten us away from thinking about components mounting and unmounting to synchronizing effects with state? And I think the answer is kind of basically yes, which is like, assume you have a cancelable promise. Assume you have a promise chain in your mind with me. Fetch /users.then. You get a response.json, then set users, json.user. So that's like 3 promises. And there's no way to cancel that using native promises. So what you do is you make like a create cancelable promise wrapper. You put your fetch in it, and then you call like .maybe then, or .then with a maybe function. And that maybe function comes from your cancelable promise, and you have some way, some object in there that tells you, should I continue or not? It's like a poor man's generator, basically. And the cancelable promise can say, if I should continue, then call dot then again, then call dot then again, and keep doing it. And so we made something like this. And the cancel part of that is to just flip that should I continue to false. And so if you return that from a hook, all of a sudden you don't have to think about mounting anymore, right? Because for whatever reason, whether that effect gets run again because the component's still mounted and refresh has changed, or the whole thing goes away, you just don't continue.
Yeah, our promise is now in sync with our hook, in the sense that when our hook's cleanup function runs, it's just going to turn the promise chain into a bunch of no-ops.
Right.
And so, yeah, okay.
So it's pretty interesting. So,
well, how many, okay, so I guess a follow-up question here is like, how many APIs that we use on a daily basis as web developers, like, that have this non-cancelable, non-throwawayable imperative?
Yeah. So that goes back to the point of Rich's talk, which is the demo he shows actually has nothing to do with effects. It actually just has to do with state. And you're like, wait, but React owns state, right? Like it's got that down. Rendering is a solved problem. Like we're talking about effects now. We're beyond state. But he shows, the issue where React UI as a function of state breaks down. And that's because like the DOM is stateful and you like change the input and like you can... If you think about just rendering an input and typing, there's a lot more state there than like the value of the input. There's like the cursor position, there's the selection, there's the focus. And then you like try to animate in the header and it's like actually the state is like how long the user's been on the page. You don't have all that state in your React app. So you don't actually have UI as a function of state because there's so much state that you don't have there. And also he's like, basically if you try to push this idea and keep pushing and pushing and pushing it, like it just makes your job so much harder than it has to be. That's kind of like his argument. And so that would be his argument, I think, applied to this case, which is like, you just want to run some code when you visit this page and like, just do that instead of like, right. But then the counter is like, no, but if you do that, then you're going to run into your problem, which is like, you didn't think about that thing. This programming model forces you to think about that thing. So those are the two arguments. I don't know which one to believe. I think it's very interesting and compelling to think about like synchronizing your effects with your state and being forced to think about how they should react to state changes. But I also think like the use interval thing, not being able to write a set interval or set timeout in a React app basically is ridiculous. Not having cancelable promises, like basically the is mounted hack that's like an escape hatch, it feels like super dirty and wrong, and there's no first class answer from React core to that solution. Like that came from a tweet and Dan was like, oh, you don't even have to use a ref, you can just use a local variable. It's like super confusing.
Yeah, but
it doesn't mean is mounted because as soon as you add a dependency, it's false.
Right. And also too, you can't tell me that I shouldn't think of my components as being mounted and then tell me to name the variable that tracks this mounted.
Yeah.
Because I can't handle that.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there could be a world where there's like first party hooks that are provided that have literally abstracted all this stuff away. But it's also like, I think Rich would say, kind of putting in his words in his mouth, would be like, that world is not going to happen, or that's like even a foolish goal because you've moved so far away from the thing you're building, which is fundamentally like this stateful UI that is like it lives in time and changes with time, and maybe the benefits aren't really going to be worth it because if the basic stuff is this confusing to experts, which it is. And I also, this is like going back to like the whole, when I was like on my ranting about React being just JavaScript 2 months ago or whatever, and it's like, okay, can we all just agree that like there's way more here than just JavaScript? And like you do have experts saying like, oh no, you're thinking about it wrong, it's hooks, but then you have those same people like they're making mistakes in public on Twitter. So like it is confusing. Like let's just acknowledge that it's definitely confusing, and like people are definitely writing bugs like all the time with this stuff. It's also solving bugs that you didn't know you had or that were coming up in hard to understand ways. But like, come on.
The just JavaScript argument is done.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, if they think it's good to use hooks, that's fine. I'm on board.
Yeah.
But
that's not convincing.
The just JavaScript is just out the window. Like you can't even say that with a straight face now.
Yeah. I mean, some people do, but
maybe they're not using hooks. For me, I think this comes down to, it's like, imagine a world where all these things that we're complaining about, like in a few years from now, there's just hooks.
Yeah.
There's a use fetch hook.
Yeah.
There's a use timeout hook, use interval. And we don't run into these problems.
It wouldn't even be use fetch. Fetch is too imperative. It would be like use. It would be like what's.
It would be like use remote
use
data.
data. Yeah. And it's like, you can't have any notion of time in there at all.
That's true. You can't fetch this thing.
Yeah.
It's remote data.
Yeah. It's like, yeah.
Yeah, because you wouldn't want to say, like, did I make a mistake by fetching this thing 500 times? It's
yeah,
like,
exactly.
That's not a question worth asking.
Exactly. By the way, though, that's also like the whole... Sorry, you want to finish your thought?
I want to say that, imagine this world with all these, like, first-party recommended hooks.
Yeah, if it's super easy to, like...
Does it help me build apps faster?
Yeah.
And it's like, even if we solve this problem and we make all these hooks easy, we don't even know that's actually going to let me build apps faster.
That's true.
So
that's also like an important question to ask. That's important to remember that is the worthwhile question and not like what's like theoretically correct or at most elegant.
Every tweet that I read, I ask myself, is this person trying to just influence the programming world, or are they trying to help me build an app faster?
That's good.
And I think that it's like 95% of the time not trying to help me.
Yeah,
but I'm also bitter.
That's pretty interesting. Getting over being sick. I was gonna say, what was I gonna say? Shoot, I lost it.
Talking about building apps.
Hold on. Fetch takes time.
We're talking about calling fetch like 500 times.
Oh yeah. Right. Wow. Yeah. See how I do at the gym tonight.
Nice. All right. From the top.
Yeah. All I was going to add to that was, what you said reminded me, like, the whole mental model of an effect is that it synchronizes with the state. And so as long as it's fully described and you have, if it's fully described, then you can run it as many times as render happens. That's actually the encouraged way to use like a useEffect hook is to have nothing as a second argument. So you just have an effect and you just run it. So let's think about like when I scroll, update the, scroll top state that I have. That you just want to run all the time, let's say. Or it's not really a good example. What's a good example where you just want to run it all the time?
I don't know. I would like you want to track renders. Is that a reason?
No,
because that's like an internal thing.
Yeah,
not like a user.
Yeah, there
thing.
is a user. There is an example. Anyways, the whole idea of like useEffect is like it just runs all the time and it should just work. Then you can add a dependency key if you have.
Can I just say something? In all the effects I've written, I always add dependency keys.
You're not supposed to.
But maybe it's because I actually do add the empty dependency key, and I think like, oh yeah, did insert element.
Yeah, you're not supposed to do that. I can prove it to you.
God, you're gonna read me the guides now.
Yeah.
Guide shame me.
React hooks useEffect. The one that nobody knows. Lets you perform side effect. Okay, it does say similar to component did mount and component did update. Okay. useEffect. Document.title equals you clicked count times. Okay, so this is an effect that is outside the component because it's updating a property on the global document object and it's setting it equal to some state on the component. But the effect is not changing the state. It's just setting it. So it's just reading from state. And, in Ember, you might have a button that increments a count. And then you say, oh, I also want the document title to say you clicked 5 times, you clicked 6 times. So you go to the action where you're incrementing count and you say document.title equals new count. Then you have a bug, right? Because you have a new way to change count and the document title no longer represents the state of count. So this is the whole argument, is that you actually want the effect mutating this global document object, the title, needs to be synced with the state. So that's what you do, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't pass in count as an argument though, because you just don't.
But why? My mental model there would be that this effect is...
You only do that if it's expensive. The whole point of the model is like, you just don't have to think about that. It's just a side effect, and you do it.
I mean, I don't buy this because I do think about this all the time. Because when I don't think about this,
It causes bugs.
I get bugs.
So that's
I'm I'm hyper sensitive to this.
Well, that's what I was kind of going to get to, but I think you're right. Effects without cleanup. Sometimes we want to run some additional code after React has updated the DOM. Network requests, manual DOM mutations, and logging are common examples of effects that don't require cleanup. We say that because we run them and immediately forget about them. So document.title equals new thing. There's no cleanup there.
Yep.
So then they go through and they do that, right? And then does useEffect run after every render? Yes, by default it runs both after the first render and every update. Later we'll see how to customize it. Instead of thinking of terms of mounting and updating, you might find it easier to think that effects happen after render. Yep. React guarantees the DOM has been updated by the time it runs the effects.
Yep.
Okay, so experienced JavaScript developers notice that the function passed to useEffect is going to be different on every render. This is intentional. In fact, this is what lets us read the count variable from inside the effect without worrying about it getting stale. So the new render happens, the new effect is created. It's a closure, but it's going to get the latest version of count because it runs.
It's from like the effects point of view or the render's point of view. It doesn't matter if it's like the 50th render or the first render.
Right, because by the time you get to that effect, the state's already there or whatever. Effects, unlike component did mount or component did update, effects schedule with useEffect don't block the browser from updating the screen. That's interesting. Maybe that's why we've had some flickering, actually. This app makes you feel more responsive, or it makes your app feel broken.
I think
the majority of effects don't need to happen synchronously. It makes sense. Ideally, if you want something that pixels with the screen, it's about state and rendering.
Right.
It's not about an effect.
There's also, use layout effect, which is after render but before paint. So we use this in one point to like calculate the button size and then we set some state based on that.
Mm-hmm. I know everyone listening, this is like long-winded, but I do have a point. It's also late, but I'm going to get there. Okay, so then they talk about cleaning up an effect. How easy that is with hooks. You return a cleanup function. Now it keeps keeps the effect in sync with no, that's not that part yet. Well, it's just that it cleans it up. So basically, why do you have that there? Because it's part of the effect. It's part of the same thing, so it's in the same function instead of like being split across two different hooks. It's like centralized. That's an argument.
Yeah, and also too, like we said, you want to throw things away, so it makes sense they're co-located.
Right there. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so then that's the main introduction to effect. Like there's nothing about dependencies. There's nothing about the second argument. That is your mental model for useEffect, what we just talked about. Tips for using effects. Tip: use multiple effects to separate concerns. So now we still have useEffect without a second arg. And explanation why effects run on each update. Here's an example of the bug, which is probably going to be what happens if the friend prop changes. So this is exactly your form case. So they're showing why does this run every time? It's exactly what you described. In a class component, we would need to add component did update to handle this case. Forgetting to handle component did update properly is a common source of bugs in React applications. You could say same thing can be said about Ember, 100%. Now consider the version of this component that uses hooks. It doesn't suffer from the bug, but we also didn't make any changes to it. There's no special code for handling updates because useEffect handles them by default. It cleans up the previous effects before applying the next effects. To illustrate this, here's a sequence of subscribe and unsubscribe calls that this component could produce over time. This behavior ensures consistency by default and prevents bugs that are common in class components due to missing update logic. Okay, I can buy that.
So this example here has a subscribe and unsubscribe.
Yeah.
Is there any dependencies?
No dependencies. So it does take an ID. It does take a friend ID, but you do not pass the friend ID into the effect.
Okay. So you're not every re-render isn't forcing. It's only the subscribe and unsubscribe only happen when the friend ID changes or the component gets unmounted.
No, it happens on every render. No, the render could happen again because of some unrelated piece of state that changes.
No, but I thought you said there was a dependency.
There's not a dependency in the effect. The effect is just a function, and it calls chat API.subscribe to friend status props.friend.id. So
yep. Okay.
If that changes, if props.friendID changes, the component will re-render.
Right.
The old effect will get cleaned up and the new one will run. But so will if is showing Boolean, toggle is
this I wouldn't ever commit this code.
I know.
Because when I think of subscribing to
like a handshake, a HTTPS handshake with your backend.
Yeah, I have nightmares of ops people calling me up and screaming at me. I can't put code like this in the code base. No, yeah, I would look at this as like, no, this is, again, this goes back. My mental model is a life cycle. My mental model is when this thing starts to render.
I see this battle in your head over the course of this episode. You're just like, the tides are turning.
This is gonna be me for the next year.
Yeah,
I'm gonna come in one day.
Dan EmberMap on this shoulder, and who I guess, Rich Harris on the other one. Tip. So now we are literally about 7/8 of the way down the page. Tip, optimizing performance by skipping effects. In some cases, cleaning up or applying the effect after every render might create a performance problem. In class components, we can solve this by writing an extra comparison with prev props or prev state inside component.update. This requirement is common enough that is built into useEffect hook API. You can tell React to skip applying an effect if certain values haven't changed between re-renders. To do so, pass an array as an optional second arg to useEffect. In the example above, we pass count as a second argument. What does that mean? If count is 5, then our component re-renders with count still equal to 5. React will compare 5 from the previous render and 5 from the next render. Because all items in the array are the same, 5 equals 5, triple equals 5, React would skip the effect. That's our optimization. But it's an optimization. When we render count with 6, React will compare, blah, 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 blah. React will rerun the effect even if just one of them is different.
I mean, I know I just said this, but this seems so incredibly wrong. One of the things I'm working on is like a WebSocket logx thing, logx.
Mm-hmm.
And when you subscribe to the stream, the server stream, you just get a whole bunch of new data.
Mm-hmm.
And then if I'm unsubscribing and resubscribing, unsubscribing and resubscribing, and I'm just keep getting that same server data over and over again, it's like, yeah, it's fine. It's not
idempotent. You have to make your effect idempotent.
It will be. Like I could remove those dependencies and it would be fine.
Yeah.
But that's
why would you do that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you would do it because effects being like
okay, but then what?
Declarative and idempotent and like pure, or like you can just run them anytime, no matter what, gives you some unknown benefits.
But this makes my like server logs now hard to read. I have things, and it's also too. It like maybe this is something I can get over, but it just makes me feel like super uncomfortable. Like this is not. It's like ignoring this thing for the sake of like a purity,
right?
Which seems
right
good.
What if a junior developer came into your team and said that this is the way we're going to write code from now on and try to start committing this?
It would be super hard to convince me that the no dependency.
Yeah, I know. No, if you use this optimization, make sure the array includes all values that change over time. If you want to run an effect and clean it up only once, use an empty array. This tells React that your effect doesn't depend on any values from props or state.
Depends on life cycle.
If you pass an empty array, yeah, exactly. Yeah. If you pass an empty array, the props and state inside the effect will always have their initial values. While passing empty array as a second arg is closer to the familiar component did mount and component will unmount mental model, there are usually better solutions to avoid rerunning effects too often. Also, don't forget that React defers running useEffect until after the browser is painted, so doing extra work is less of a problem. Yeah. Interesting, right?
I mean, this is good. Maybe the next few effects I write, I'll think about
what it would be like to run them over and over and over and over and over
again.
It's literally the last part of that page. But no, I'm that's what I'm saying is that's like crap, because like if you look at everyone's hooks, everyone's code on Twitter who's doing this, everyone's writing, everyone, if you're going to make a Ajax request to fetch the list of to-dos when you boot the app, you're going to do it once. You're not going to write it in a way that's going to be able to fetch it over and over and over again whenever React decides it's time to re-render. That's not how anyone's building apps. Maybe one day something like that will happen. Now, if you subscribe to a thing, I can see that being different. But like, there's so many things that involve time.
What if there's something? Sorry, we're going down a rabbit hole.
Oh, we've been there, buddy.
What if there's something where it's like thinking about the call to fetch is wrong? Instead, you want to think about a call to like a service that coalesces those calls to fetch. So you can run your fetch over and over and over again, and then you have some service
that buffers them or something.
Yeah, that's like, actually, you don't need to do a network request. I can return you the last data here, and that way you get to keep this pure, beautiful component, but then you can have like these ugly objects that hide everything, but your components still have like just beautiful declarative code.
I guess that's like but that's like you like use resource or something. Like you could do it with that, but like the way you would implement that would be with like a dependencies array and all this stuff. It's weird to me that like it feels like it's fine to get there, but the lower level stuff should acknowledge it, and because it doesn't, you have weird things like what we've seen on Twitter, and you have weird things like using refs when it feels wrong, and it feels like it leaks in certain places, and like Rich was saying, basically it just doesn't always line up. And so I agree that like the idea of, we do this in Ember Data, where we talk about this all the time, where if you do have a bug like that, there is something you have failed to describe in your code. And if you can do it in a declarative way, that's good. I just don't know if like this seems like a big ask to go all the way there. And also it feels like it's not honest about how many parts of the apps we build don't fall into this model, and it makes it harder to think about. When I render the app, when you visit the homepage, fetch the list of movies, you basically can't express that in hooks. You have to express it as something else.
Yep.
I don't even know what it is. It's like a side effect of visiting the home page is like,
I mean, you can't express it, but it's ugly for all the reasons that we talked about in the beginning of the bug that we just fixed on our website. Wrapping promises and maybe then.
Now, if promises were cancelable, that would be interesting. If more things were like that, maybe you could see a world where it makes more sense. But it is very, very confusing and mind-bendy and confusing. It's confusing.
Maybe like it's just like a gallery or a cookbook of like just like,
that would help.
Like, okay, here's why you feel shitty when you use promises in useEffect. It's because you can't throw them away.
Right. They're not cancelable. They're fundamentally like things that can't be canceled and can't be synced with things. There's an impedance mismatch. Here's why set interval sucks. Here's why set timeout sucks. And here's why 50% of what you do is going to suck in our new mental model.
But no, there are some things that are good, like the data 100%. The data fetching form, or like the like window resize is a hook with an effect. It's amazing. It's nice. It's simple. Everyone can understand it.
Yep.
So maybe just like a cookbook.
Yeah. What was I going to say? Here we go again. Wow. Pretty bad. I wanted to make a point.
Saying it's crappy that you can just fall asleep on the microphone. That can be your point. Saying it's crappy that this is why you use hooks, the impedance mismatch.
Yeah, it was before that.
What the real test here is? We need to get some people that don't work on the React team at Facebook.
That's what I was gonna say.
Super drunk and be like, "What do you think of hooks?" And they'll be like, "This is not solving my problem." So they'll be like, "It's amazing."
Yeah, that's true. That's true, because they all are usually like ahead in a sense that what they talk about publicly, they've already been experimenting with. That's what I was gonna say though.
Go
I lost it.
Was it if Facebook developers working on React apps are facing problems that hooks solve, that means there's like a good thing there, and that the React team is solving real app problems. Right. That's like a good enough proxy to tell that they're solving real app problems.
Right.
So we just need to get some Facebook developers drunk.
Yeah. This is what I was going to say. I just want to see how to build a to-do app. I'm not kidding. I want agreement from Sebastian, Ryan, and Michael Jackson, and Dan Abramov about how to build a to-do app that has CRUD. Like, no joke. I want to see that.
Yeah.
Now, would you see complete unanimous agreement for something like that from the Ember community? I mean, you get pretty close, especially if you use Ember concurrency. right? With handling those cases, because those cases are the fair point on the React side is like those cases that you're showing that seem like problematic for hooks are like, that's not why hooks were created. Hooks were created to give you a consistent way to approach this problem that scales, like with complexity. So the to-do demo needs to account for, cleaning up when the component's not mounted and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
But I think you could do it with Ember, with actions, Ember concurrency, and it'd be pretty straightforward and pretty
I'll even go
simple.
further and say that you can only do it in Ember with just Ember new and no add-ons, no Ember concurrency. Maybe we should make Ember concurrency default add-on.
Yeah.
But no.
Yeah.
I would say that like our code might not all look the same.
Yeah.
But I think Ember developers would just kind of like shrug and say, "Oh yeah, you could do that.
Right.
That's fine. I've seen that." Like I don't think there would be a fundamental.
Right.
I don't think
saving a to-do as a result of a state change versus.
Right. I don't think an Ember developer would say something like, "No, you're not thinking about it correctly."
Right.
So I think that's
right.
Going back to the saving the to-do as a function of state change. Kind of like the examples we talked about in this episode, like the form thing I brought up, the stuff that you were reading in the docs, it kind of makes sense that you have these effects that are a function of state. There are times when it makes sense to have these effects that are a function of state change.
You're saying because
should we buy into it all, or is that just too
the Ryan Florence approach? You're saying,
which I would never do.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, like you're saying, like if I click save on this new to do, and then I just like go and do some imperative steps, what have you not thought about? You've not thought about like what if new to do changes? Should it repatch the server?
What if there's like another way to save a to do?
Right.
Like that's kind of like the whole lesson of declarative programming is like it doesn't matter how the variable changes. Your template's going to update.
Maybe one way to think about this is if you had like a WebSocket and you were like plugged into the database and you were like doing concurrent editing, like operational transform stuff, where there's like the fetching and the persisting requests are like these like time-based imperative things, but imagine they didn't exist. Imagine you were just writing things to like a hard drive directly. Maybe it would look more like that. Anytime this thing, it's like an observer, right? Anytime this new to-do body changes, you just save it to local storage. Like, what if you wrote your whole app that would save to local storage, and then you switched it from being local storage to being a network, a backend over the network? Would you be able to do that in such a way that the only code you change is in effects that actually persists the logic?
This is actually one of the things I've been working on. And that's what I did. But I did it as a dependency. I have a state dependency, and every time state changes,
you persist to local storage.
Yeah.
So that's the Ryan Florence model. That is that's pushing the React model to the extreme.
The reason I do this
as opposed to saying like, oh, we've updated it and now we know to just persist it.
I got to pull up my code because I have to look at actually what I'm using as dependencies. The reason I do this is because the store can change outside of user events. So as data gets pushed in from a server, I want to persist that data locally so it's available on refresh. And so that's
what's the example? What's the app? What's the
I'm building like a toy logix.
Gotcha.
So I have data.
So yeah, you're saying the data can change in another way than the action. And so since you have the effect synced with the state, it doesn't matter. You can add new ways to change the state and the effect will always be in sync. So it actually works without bugs. So you're actually proving their point. You crossed enemy lines, my friend.
So, okay.
So are we talking ourselves into this?
Well, hold on. I want to keep going down this road, and then there's going to be at some point where I'm just going to throw up my hands and say I'm not doing that. But
so let's say to do example, right?
I have an action, and I have a button that I want to click, and I want that to trigger saving a to do. So what happens when I click that button?
So this is the thing, right? You have a new to do. I've got like 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay,
I think we do it. This is a good one though. Yeah, it's fine. You type in you have a new to do app. You render it. You have an input. You start typing in text. So you have like new to do text as some state, right? Mm-hmm. You don't want that to trigger an effect because you don't want to hit the effect until you hit enter, right? So it's almost like, here, go with me for a second. Let's take a case where you have an existing to do. You have an existing to do with ID 1. It's right there. It says buy milk. And then you add an exclamation point to it, right? you don't want it to save until you hit the user hits enter. Okay, but so you have like to do .text and it's like a local variable. But like when you hit enter, maybe it like rolls itself. Here's a question. If you type an exclamation point and someone else changes it on the back end, what should happen to the UI? I mean, this can get complex.
Yeah. Let's what's like the easiest case? Like,
no, but that is the question though, because the question is like, what UI element, what state does it sync with? So you're trying to think about, this is where I was going with this. Let's say you have to do one, and then as soon as the user starts editing it, you fork it basically. You have draft to do one, which is like a separate piece of state in your app, and you start changing it. As soon as you hit enter, you merge it. And so now you're back to do one. And now you have an effect that's like to do one has changed. I need to like sync it. Like if you were writing this with local storage, that's kind of what you would do, right? It's the code you say.
Yeah.
You don't want to save it to local storage until you hit the save button. And the save button is committing the draft to the original state object.
Yes.
And it's a effect of that state object changing. So it's like canonical to do one changes. That's the thing that triggers the effect, not is saving. It's true.
Okay, so I have a dispatch. Dispatch changes some like data in my store. Think of like an Ember data store.
Okay.
And then
it's really the model.
The state updates that causes my component to re-render because it has like a dependency on state.
Yeah.
And then because it's rerun,
canonical,
it syncs to local storage.
Because it's rerun, I think all you need is an effect that depends on, that just takes, you could even have it with no dependencies, right? If it was cheap, let's say, the persist operation. Yep. The effect syncs with the canonical representation of the to-do. And if that ever changes, you need to sync it with the storage mechanism. So anytime canonical to do one changes, you're going to persist it. And you can change it with a form. And when you click edit, it creates a draft thing. And when you click save, it just updates canonical to do one.
And then by calling like set state, set to do, or you could change it with props, or you could change it by pushing new data into a Redux store or the store. Okay, so that's a good argument for, going back to your declarative rendering series, that's a good argument for having effects that save data.
Yeah.
I've never been...
now we have to read why Dan said not to do that.
Yeah.
Because maybe there's a bug there. Anyways, it's very different from how you think about it, but...
I need to try... I mean, this episode is good because it just tells me that the way I've been thinking about these things, I'm still doing a mental mapping, and that I should go back
and push the model a little bit further.
Yeah, and see what that would look like, and see if that I have any aha moments.
I mean, the declarative rendering stuff, there's so much there to unpack, and so many people, it's easy to say, oh yeah, UI is a function of state, but when we made that series that we had, and the tons of conversations we've had about it over the last few years, there's like so much there, and it's extremely powerful, and it's not at all obvious or intuitive at the beginning, and we still learn things from it, even like just wrapping imperative APIs with declarative APIs. And so maybe this stuff is just at the beginning of that, but maybe we'll be saying the same things about it. And maybe it's also true that it's a theoretically good and elegant approach, but it's actually not gonna be useful for either for a long time, or
it's not there.
Or right now,
there's more important things for real UI apps.
I do think it'd be interesting though to build an app that persists to local storage, because if you take the async out of it, should it change things? And you're kind of like, well, maybe it shouldn't. And
it absolutely. I mean,
it shouldn't.
It shouldn't. It absolutely should.
I mean, it shouldn't. So, except that like you say that, but then it's like, wait a second, you're telling me as soon as you start making your app like asynchronous and state, every async thing adds a new piece of state, like a new state.
Right.
Is saving, is loading. You're acknowledging those things with these variables. Obviously, it matters. Like your whole UI changes. You're building a separate app.
Your UI. Okay, so your UI changes, but your persistence logic shouldn't change.
I mean, I can wrap my head around that. That's like what causes this thing to be persisted. That can be encapsulated, and then how you persist it, and how you show that persistence is happening maybe is like a separate piece. it's also a lot to ask for someone. It's like, well, yeah, I just want to save the to-do when I click the button.
I know.
It's like, that's all I wanted. You're telling me you can't do that? I'm going to need 6 months.
Yeah.
And a log-based storage
Yeah,
system.
yeah.
15 engineers from Facebook.
I mean, but maybe that's what will like push us towards this, is just having like multiple ways to save data, not just a button.
Yeah.
And then we really kind of say like, oh, okay.
We weren't thinking about this.
Yeah.
And it's way better to think about it from the beginning or something like that.
I'm going to have fun with my next few hooks.
Nice.
I'm going to make a freaking mess.
My question is still, if experts who've been doing React for 5 years can't agree with a core team member about how to create a to-do app, what the hell chance do we have?
Yeah. None. That's...
It'll be interesting to see. All right, we got to wrap up.
Yeah. Welcome to or thank you for listening to this week's episode of Hook Therapy.
I really find it really interesting, the two paradigms. There's times I miss Ember for sure, or I go back to my Ember code and my demos or whatever, and I'm like, man, it's just great to like have to do something and have one way and just do it. And I'm just like, man, that's awesome.
Yeah. Yes. Agreed.
And I think it's a combination of this stuff being confusing and also me still being new to React, but it's pretty interesting stuff. And I've resisted like learning new programming languages and things in the past, and people always say like it's really good to learn this stuff, it just gives you a new way of thinking about it, and I know it's true, but I just sometimes I'm just wanting to focus on my own stuff. So this has been a good forcing function to kind of step out of my comfort zone and learn some new patterns.
Yeah, we definitely joined React at the right time.
Yeah.
We held out long enough, and then we joined.
Yeah, exactly.
During all this. So yeah, it's been fun.
Cool. All right, everyone. If you like this podcast, a review is the best way to help people find it. Give us a 5-star review if you love us. And what should they do if they hate us?
5 stars.
All right, 5 stars. You heard it from Ryan. Thanks a lot for those 5-star reviews. We'll see you next week.
See ya.